What's up, everybody? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Hey, we got a really exciting show. We got a awesome guest, Gerrard Williams. He's an author, journalist, soon-to-be filmmaker. I believe his film is coming out later this year, I believe. Gerrard, is that correct?
Yes, we've just sold the distribution rights in America, so you guys will be able to see it, I hope, quite soon, next couple of months.
Awesome. And he did the book Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler, and it's an interesting story, because one thing that I found really intriguing was I haven't really run into a lot of things talking about the escape of Hitler, but it's amazing once you actually hear the alternative information and you actually look into it. It's amazing. You're not the only journalist and only author, and there's been plenty of other people who've written about this, spoken about it, and it's amazing how. And I've even talked to a couple friends about this show, and a couple friends that are real big World War II buffs and love that part of history and love researching it. And they're like, it's amazing that I haven't read anything about this. And why do you think that is?
I really don't know, Ricky. It's when I first looked into the story, I was in Argentina, and I came across making other documentaries, and I came across this story that Hitler had escaped to Argentina by submarine. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm going to do a silly film about Hitler escaping on a submarine. And then I started to look into the story. And if you go back and look at the contemporaneous reporting at the time, Stalin said that he'd escaped to Spain or Argentina. Eisenhower said, we have no proof that Hitler is dead. We have found no bodies. Marshal Zhukov, who was in charge of the Soviet forces when they took Berlin, said they had found no body that could have been Adolf Hitler. The BBC reporter, Thomas Cadet, who was actually embedded with the Soviet troops, I don't think they called it embedded in those days, but he was with the Soviet troops when they took the bunker, saw that the Russians had been given a number of very poor doubles of what they thought were just poor doubles of Hitler, but not of Hitler himself. Hugh Trevor Roper is the man behind all this. He's the British historian who was put in by the British government to do the last days of Adolf Hitler, to actually put a full stop at the paragraph of hell that was World War II. Trevor Roper was a very ineffective detective. He'd never had any detective background or police background, interrogation background at all. He'd written one book about a medieval archbishop in Britain, and yet, for some reason, he was the man that the British government decided they would put in instead of Scotland Yard or the FBI or OSS or any of the intelligence organizations, that he was the man who would be put in to tell the story of the death of Adolf Hitler. The people he interviewed, actually, he didn't interview in a number of cases. Hannah Reich, who's famous for being the most incredible female pilot and unreconstructed Nazi of World War II. Hannah Reich was never interviewed by Trevor Roper. He was given access to some of the interrogation reports that the Americans had done with her. Von Bülow, who was the Luftwaffe adjutant in the bunker, said after the war that every time he read what he had told Trevor Roper, he used to laugh, because they were all lies. There were no bodies found. There's no forensic evidence to the death of Adolf Hitler or his then girlfriend Eva Braun in the bunker in 1945. And once I started finding out this material, and then we found out the pilot who had flown them out of Berlin, who gave testimony to a Warsaw court in 1947, it struck me that we simply have not been told the truth. Then in the Argentine side, we found numerous witnesses who had all seen Adolf Hitler and his wife after the war, all living in Patagonia in southern Argentina.
Yeah, and anybody who's familiar with Operation Paperclip knows that the U.S. and many countries have let basically Nazi Germans escape, and some of them even started U.S. programs. And the NASA program was started by a Nazi German, and so it's not. Once I heard of your research and your book, I actually wasn't surprised. I was actually surprised that I haven't fallen upon this information sooner, but I wasn't surprised because of Operation Paperclip and knowing that.
Paperclip's a good example. I mean, President Truman said at the end of World War II that the American government would never employ any members of the former Nazi Party. 10,000 of them were later employed by the American government. And as you mentioned, Werner von Braun, the man responsible for the V-1 and V-2 rockets that killed close to 5,500 people in Britain during the war, and a number of people in Rotterdam as well, after we had invaded Europe. Werner von Braun went on to basically be the father of NASA. I mean, he put America on the moon. Werner von Braun was an SS colonel responsible for the deaths of over 30,000 slave workers in factories across Germany while he created his vengeance weapons. To me, it would be a little bit like getting the man who plotted the 9/11 attacks and putting him in charge of air traffic control in the United States. But the enemy of my enemy is my friend, I suppose, and for some reason, not the American government, but the military-industrial complex, which both Kennedy and Eisenhower referred to. It was them who put them in charge. It was them who gave them jobs. It was them who gave them Purcell shines, they're known as, so they were washed whiter than white, and then employed by the American government. And von Braun is a particular hate figure for me. He's now considered a wonderful man for everything he did for NASA. Well, he was a murdering swine. I mean, wonderful man, murdering swine, two visions of a different man. But there was a lot of deals done. There were a lot of deals done at the end of World War II. And one of them was to allow Adolf Hitler to escape with the help of OSS, which later became CIA under Allen Dulles. And it was all organized by Martin Bormann, who seems to have been painted out of history, the most important man in Germany after Adolf Hitler, the party secretary of the National Socialist Democratic Arbeiters Party, the Nazi party.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that there were already a lot of Nazis in Argentina. A lot of them did flee, like you said. So, and the thing is, the most interesting thing about looking into you, and we talked about this before we went on air, was the fact that you don't have a history of writing conspiracy theory novels, or, I mean, you're a journalist, you've worked for BBC, you've done reporting all over the world. So this wasn't actually your realm of expertise as a conspiracy theory thing. It was just something that you kind of fell upon, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, not at all. I covered both Gulf Wars, did the aftermath of both Gulf Wars in Baghdad, 2.5 years in Yugoslavia during the Bosnian Civil War, the massacres in Rwanda, the election of the Mandela government in South Africa, the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, I'm 55 as a journalist working for top news organizations. And I was making documentaries in Argentina. That's how all this started, and came across this story. And I thought, okay, time to do a silly story, Gerrard. You've never done one, so time to do a silly story. And then as I looked into it, and Simon, my co-author, who's a military historian of some repute, as we looked into it, it became very obvious that the story we had been told, that the story that's been accepted by all mainstream historians, simply is not true.
Yeah, and even the History Channel did a special on it, and I was surprised that they had they actually had a video, or I saw somewhere the video of Catalina Gamera, or I believe, she there's actual video of her testimony. I mean, it's amazing how much information's out there when you actually research. And the History Channel actually tested the skull, I believe, right?
They DNA tested the skull in Russia. It's that of a woman in her 40s. They've always said it was Adolf Hitler's. Well, unless Adolf Hitler was a cross-dresser, we have a problem here. And it can't be Eva Braun either. She was in her early 20s when it collapsed in Berlin.
And the Soviets, their stories changed quite a few times too, because initially they said that they didn't find anything, right? Stalin believed that he got away. Then some years later they said that they did find a body, right? Their story has been inconsistent also. Yeah,
I mean, their story has definitely been inconsistent. All I can go with is the material that was done at the time. Anything that's post that time, about Hitler's body or the corpses in the bunker, I simply don't trust, because people have had time to make up their stories. But the reporting from the actual days when Hitler escaped from Berlin, the 29th and 30th of April 1945, that's the immediate aftermath. People are there. People are in the bunker. They haven't found any corpses. They have found Magda and Joseph Goebbels' corpses, which were completely recognizable despite the fact they'd had petrol poured on them and they'd been set afire. And they found the bodies of the 6 Goering children, Goebbels' children, my apologies, who'd been murdered by their mother, so they didn't have to live in a non-National Socialist Germany. But of Hitler and Eva Braun, no evidence whatsoever. Or of Martin Bormann. Martin Bormann, I go back to him all the time. He's supposedly dead in Berlin in 1945, along with the head of the Gestapo SS, General Muller. And they find Martin Bormann's bones in 1972 in a place they dug up 4 times before. And in the 1990s, they DNA test them, and they say, this is definitely Martin Bormann. Well, that would be fine. DNA is acceptable evidence in a court of law. However, they refuse to name the relative that they got the matching DNA from. They say this was from some unnamed 83-year-old relative of Martin Bormann's. Well, Bormann had 5 surviving children they could have gone to for DNA without any problems whatsoever. And the children said they had never, ever heard of this 83-year-old relative. And they asked the German government to tell them who it was, as have I. But they refused to. They simply say, no, we have a definite match. Well, that's like me saying, I'm your father, Ricky. Except, we haven't DNA tested, and you're not a definite match for me. And I don't think I'm that, but I've got sons your age probably, but it's ridiculous. It's not evidence. It's not real. But a lot of this goes back to something that Adolf Hitler said himself, which is if you tell a lie long enough and loudly enough and often enough, it becomes the truth. And that's what we're looking at here, is a lie that's been repeated and repeated and repeated and never looked at by mainstream historians, who I think are the laziest researchers in the world generally. They simply accept whatever mainstream historians say and quote them in their books. So they don't go back to the original source material. And that's just lazy.
Yeah, I think that's a huge problem with history is, one, just like the common idea of history is written by the winners. So obviously if you get the story from the losers, they obviously have a very different account on what happened. And so that's a big thing too. I mean, usually you're reading one official story, and like anybody who's researched history, they know that there's not only one official story and there's not only one story. So that's a huge issue. And what makes Martin Bormann so important? What I know you focus a lot on him.
He's the head of the party, head of the Nazi party, so he has the controlling power in the population, not in the army, not in the military at all. But Bormann is, from 1943 on, if you want to get to Adolf Hitler, you have to go through Martin Bormann. He controls everything. He also controls all the Gauleiters, the people, they'd be the equivalent, I suppose, of mayors or town councils throughout Germany. He also controls the money, the funds in the party. I mean, recently articles have shown that Hitler himself had a fortune of 3.6 billion pounds. That's about 8 billion US dollars stashed away in Swiss banks, along with his private art collection, which was stashed away as well, none of which has ever been recovered. Martin Bormann set this up so that every time a stamp with Hitler's face on it, or a copy of Mein Kampf was made, or a poster was made with Hitler on it, Hitler got a couple of pennies on each one, or a euro, not a euro, a Reichsmark in those days, on each one. And this built up into a personal fortune that was massive at the time. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And this was all Bormann's doing. Bormann also had control within the party of quite a lot of the economic aspects of things. It was he who dealt with international bankers, and they did this throughout the war anyway. But it was also he who helped get contracts to the main German industries. And so in 1943, when he told them, all the German main industries, that you must get your capital out of Germany, and you must get your goods and your patents and your plans out of Germany, we are losing this war, they set up something like 700 front companies across the world. Argentina, Syria, Egypt, Turkey, all places that were neutral, Argentina especially. And they moved capital quite easily, in the same way that you and I could do it today by Western Union or from our bank. They just said to the Swiss, okay, we'd like you to transfer this amount of money, please, to this bank in Buenos Aires. And the Swiss took their 6%, and they were perfectly happy. And they shifted country buying money out of Germany, much of which later went back into Germany to form the West German economic miracle in the 1940s and 50s.
That quote that you said was so important. The idea of you keep repeating something, people will start believing it. It's one of my favorite quotes because I think that people didn't realize the master of propaganda that Hitler was. And what do you think was his plan? To go to Argentina and possibly eventually start, I guess... It's very difficult really to say. I mean, I think that he was quite unwell in 45. The July bomb plot, which was made famous with the Tom Cruise film, Valkyrie. I think he'd been hurt worse in that bomb plot than they let on. When he eventually made it to either 53 days submerged in a submarine across the Atlantic, it's not the most comfortable. So there was a big base there ready for him. And of course they had country buying types of money. I mean, huge amounts of money available to them. I think the plan was to try and rebuild a Fourth Reich in the sun in some ways.
But I think that Martin Bormann very quickly realized that in the Holocaust and the horror, that nobody would ever march behind the swastika again, and that Germany probably would not follow Hitler if he suddenly turned up back in Argentina saying, "Rise up for me." I think Bormann realized that the real power in the world is all about money and economics and industry, and he controlled so much of that and was able to invest in so much of that that he had real power available to him, and so did the remnants of the Nazi Party, who went on to work with him in West Germany after the war. So there was no real reason. Hitler seems to have been sidelined by this new party, this new economic and financial institution that is still out there and immensely wealthy. And Hitler was sidelined by Bormann, who realized that he was pretty much a man not of that time anymore, that was the end for the Nazis and Hitler, but it was not the end of the grasp of power, and they carried on with that all the way through.
Yeah, that Valkyrie operation is interesting because that's when he started. He got a little nervous, and that's when he started using a lot of body doubles and stuff like that. Right after.
Yeah, I think there were doubles around from probably the early 30s. One of his drivers used to stand in for him quite regularly. But I mean, we prove in Grey Wolf, the Escape of Adolf Hitler, the book, that the last pictures of Adolf Hitler, which are supposedly, terribly famous, and it's Hitler handing out medals to Hitler Youth who'd been killing Soviet tanks in Berlin, April the 20th, 1945. They've always been said to me, well, we know those pictures were taken on March the 20th, 1945, because they appear in the April edition of the Hitler Youth magazines. They couldn't be shot on April the 20th. And we've had it scientifically proved by a facial recognition expert that the man in the pictures is not Adolf Hitler. It's a double of some sort. We also know from British intelligence reports from that time that there was another double who lived and worked around Berchtesgaden, the Eagle's Nest, the retreat in Bavaria that Hitler had. So we know that there were doubles available, and we know that he used them on a regular basis. And I think they were used a lot more in the final days of the war because he wasn't very well.
And also, Stalin had a thing called Operation Myth, right, where he basically looked into him possibly.
Well, this was supposed the final report on Hitler's death, and there are all these things about. They did find the body after having looked in the same place, and Hitler's body was then put in a box, and then in the end it was all bashed up and dropped in a drain somewhere in East Germany. But I mean, I have no idea why that was written. I think it was sort of propaganda. Maybe it was necessary for them to believe that Hitler had died. Maybe Stalin wanted to make something out of that.
Now, do you think personally that people knew, or the U.S. government possibly knew, or one of the other governments in the Allies knew that Hitler escaped and let it happen? Did they make a deal, or do you think that they honestly didn't know and just went with the official story?
No, I don't think it's governments. I mean, I have this problem. The more I research the story, and we carry on with our research after Grey Wolf, is that there seems to be an America One out there, which is the America I always believed in, led by Eisenhower and Truman and JFK and maybe even your current president, although I'm not massively impressed. And then there's America Two, which is the military-industrial complex, the CIA, at those days the OSS, the Chase Manhattan Bank, Ford Motor Company, IBM, ITT, all these hugely powerful corporations, all of whom did business with the Nazis before the war and after the war. And in fact, John Dulles, who became the CIA's chief, was a corporate lawyer in Germany before the war, doing deals with the Nazis. So I think there was a deal done, but not between what I used to think of as the United States of America, your elected government. Well, obviously there were deals done because 10,000 Nazi scientists were brought in by this OSS CIA cabal without the knowledge and definitely against the direct instructions of President Truman. So loads of things seem to be going on with America Two and the Nazis, while America One, which is your elected representatives and your presidents, I don't think knew a damn thing. They may have had their suspicions. I mean, JFK definitely had his suspicions about the CIA. Shortly before his murder, he was going to smash it into 1,000 pieces. And 4 days later, he's dead in Dallas. And the two guys sitting on the Warren Commission, I don't get into JFK as conspiracy theory, But the two guys sitting on the Warren Commission are Alan Dulles and a man called John J. McCloy. Now, McCloy ran Germany after World War II, pretty much as the potentate there. And again, he'd been a corporate lawyer before World War II. He'd sat in Hitler's box at the Munich Olympics. He was very close to Martin Bormann, as was Alan Dulles. So you can make your own mind up on this. But, people like Henry Ford. The Ford Motor Company made over a third of the trucks that were used by the German army during World War II. All that money went back to Detroit. All those profits went back to Detroit. Henry Ford himself was a Nazi, an anti-Semite, a horrible man. Hitler gave him the highest civilian decoration that the Nazi Party could offer. And he quotes him at length in Mein Kampf, from Ford's Semitic writings in the 1910s, 1920s. So there was a distinct link between corporate America, led by these lawyers who later went on to run the CIA, but led OSS during World War II, and the Nazi Party. And I think all they were interested in, as many people are still today, was just making a profit. When you think that ITT owned 25% of the Focke-Wulf aircraft company during World War II. Well, these Focke-Wulf aircraft company were producing fighters to shoot down American bombers over Europe.
Yeah,
and the American company was making money out of it.
Yeah, that's one thing you see in international policy and companies. I mean, really, corporations could care less about what side they're on or who, as long as they're making a buck. I mean, like you said, IBM, I believe made the, I don't know if it was a time card or what type of equipment to keep track of.
The counting machines at the death camps. Yep. And Americans were actually at Auschwitz and Treblinka and Dachau making sure those systems worked.
Yeah, and
IBM employees.
And Hugo Boss made some of their clothes and
Hugo Boss signed the SS uniforms.
Really?
Made them throughout the war. And now Hugo Boss is on the corner of every street of every capital in the world. I personally won't wear Hugo Boss, although I do have a rather nice leather jacket made by them. But I won't wear it anymore because it just disgusts me.
Yeah, and I think there's even links to Prescott Bush and giving loans to Nazis, I believe, right?
Yeah, Prescott Bush and Standard Oil were very much involved. In fact, he was actually charged with dealing with the enemy. Trading with the enemy after World War II, and the charges were eventually dropped because he was just too important and his contacts were too important. But I mean, it's things like, everybody thinks that America ran this wonderful crusade, and I'm not mocking all those American boys and girls who died and fought for what they thought was liberty and the right way. My father was a combat soldier in World War II, wounded 3 times in Africa and up through Italy. I have nothing but the greatest respect for that great generation, but they were lied to. When you think that those American boys are driving to the beaches in Ford Motor Company trucks, and the German boys are driving to the beaches in Ford Motor Company trucks, you have to worry about who's making money out of this. The American oil companies put up the price of petrol before D-Day by 30%.
Wow.
And the American army had no choice but to buy it at the inflated rate. So, while you were hitting the beaches at Omaha and we were at Golden Sword, and the Canadians were there too, the American oil companies were making 30% more than they had the week before because we needed so much petrol.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's a big thing that people get confused with. I don't think being America did this great thing of making people believe that if you're anti-war, you're anti-troops, and I think that I think that's a ridiculous concept. I have a huge amount of respect for serving people. My sister was an army officer, and I have a huge respect for people who put their boots on the ground and put their hearts and lives where their beliefs are. And professional soldiers are those things. And we have to look recently at Iraq and Afghanistan and wonder what the hell we were doing there, in both countries, and why we lost so many boys there. But somebody's made a lot of money out of Iraq. Maybe somebody should have a look at Dick Cheney's bank. I don't think he cares about anybody, but about the fact that Halliburton made a fortune. Oh,
billions.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Halliburton made tons of money. KBR. I mean, Blackwater. I mean, all these companies are making, and that's the thing. War is money, and when there's so much money in wars, you're going to see a lot more of it, and you're going to continuously see a conflict. I think our foreign policy. I remember watching the film based on the book, The Trials of Henry Kissinger, by Christopher Hitchens, and they made a documentary out of it, and it blew my mind how every single basically every conflict that the media sold us, there's always a strategy behind why we're
Completely.
Politically.
Completely.
Yeah,
Well, I came across Kissinger's involvement in Latin America while I was doing documentaries about the Dirty War in Argentina, where 30,000 people were disappeared by the fascist junta at the time. And there's a memo from Kissinger which basically says, "Can you do this while Congress aren't in session, please, so that I can get approval for it? So there won't be any problems with us." And you just look at these people and you think Kissinger's meant to be a great man. I mean, he's got a very dodgy World War II history as well. He was CIC in Germany at the end of the war, a corporal basically running a major city. And he probably knew. I mean, he's almost definitely linked into this this cabal, this America too, that to me seems pretty obvious now. But at the time in 1945, when the Nazis were finished, well, they'd been defeated militarily in some ways, but they had not been defeated because so many of them were allowed to escape. In Grey Wolf, we thought that maybe 10,000 had got out of Germany at the end of World War II. But when you add in all the European fascists, then you have to remember that it was Frenchmen, Scandinavians, and Flemish who were defending Hitler in Berlin at the end of the war. The SS divisions, Charlemagne, the Flemish division, I can't remember, and the Nordland division were the people defending Hitler at the end of the war. Very few German troops in Berlin at the end of the war. They're mainly European fascists. If you add the European fascists in and the Croatian fascists in, plus a hell of a lot more Nazis than I ever thought, more than 100,000 were funneled out through Vatican City between 1945 and 1948. With the complete knowledge of the Catholic Church and Pope Pius XII, although this has been denied by the Vatican forever, and many of them on International Committee for the Red Cross travel documents. Why did we let 100,000 murderers leave Germany or leave Europe? I mean, it's not quite beyond me because I've been a cynical hack a lot of my life, a cynical journalist. But that level of cynicism in American authorities, British authorities, is mind-blowing. Mind-blowing. I mean, I think the Vatican were involved because these people had murdered Europe's Jews, and maybe the Catholic Church didn't think that was a bad thing. Jews were always called Christ killers by the Church. And of course, most of these men were Christian, and the real threat was from godless communism in the Soviet Union. So it's a really dirty period of our history that has not been. We've just scratched the surface of doing Grey Wolf. I mean, there's so much more. There's so much more material coming out now than actually is available. It's almost not important that Adolf Hitler escaped. What's important is that deals were done with people who systematically and industrially murdered millions upon millions upon millions of people. The Nazis killed 20 million in Russia. Now probably 11 million, not 6 million in the camps. It's foul. It's really disgusting. And you can tell, Ricky, it makes me quite angry. If my father was still with us, he'd be oiling up his Lee Enfield 303 and going out looking for people to shoot.
Yeah, I think what the idea of the way you put it, the America One, America Two, I think is really important because I think being patriotic in America and nationalism, I mean, it turns us against each other. And I think that one thing we have to look at is the troops, the people in America. There's a lot of good people out there, but unfortunately, the way people look at this country and our foreign policy is basically this handful of people who make these decisions, and then that represents the country. And unfortunately, just like the Valkyrie, the German military trying to take down Hitler, not every German was a Nazi and believed in what was going on, and just same way with not every American believes in what Kissinger did or what America is doing at the moment.
Of course not. And I mean, it's Americans of all political shape and color, and there's nothing wrong with being proud, being a proud nationalist. I mean, I don't do nationalism very easily, but I can understand why people are proud of the United States and the opportunities it's given to so many people over the years. I mean, you're an immigrant nation. There was the United States until 17 whatever. But it's the way that these cynical, and it's not the Illuminati, and it's not some sort of lizards dressed in human skins. It's just people who like to make money and don't give a damn about the general population. I mean, you can take the Iraq War as a good example. Tony Blair, is up there with Kissinger, as far as I'm concerned, as somebody who should be put on trial. Tony Blair told the British that there were weapons of mass destruction which could be deployed in 20 minutes. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It was all about oil. And now look at the mess we're in. Tens of thousands of our boys and your boys dead on the ground. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. And what have we got out of it? Nothing. Both America and Britain look like idiots.
And the country's just as bad as ever it's been with ISIS and all that's
I was in the country when Saddam Hussein ran it, and he wasn't a nice man, but there weren't hundreds of thousands of people dying, and there wasn't ISIS around. And on one hand, we think Saddam Hussein's a terrible person, and we're a bit off track at the moment, I know, but on the one hand, we think Saddam Hussein's a bad person. On the other hand, we have Saudi Arabia as one of our main allies, where women are not allowed to drive, where women have to cover their face all the time, where you can have your hand chopped off if you steal something, where you can be stoned to death for adultery. These are nice people. Well, not really.
Yeah, well, and same thing with China. I mean, we paid for a lot of the Iraq war with money loan from China, and we're trying to take down a dictator while funding another dictator in China. So it doesn't make.
That's because somebody's making 6% on every transaction.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean that's the thing. I think people have to realize that. It's not about human rights. I mean, you look at Kissinger won a Nobel Peace Prize, but he can't go into certain countries because he's a war criminal. He's considered a war criminal.
He'll be arrested if he arrives in Europe.
Yeah. So I mean, so you look at it like you said, there's America one. There's a perception that they try to sell everybody, and then there's what really happens. And like you said, I think it's simpler than Illuminati or reptilians, and stuff like that. I think if we just focus on and that's the thing. I think a lot of those conspiracy theories, even though there's some truth to some of them, and I don't. You should never dismiss something as a conspiracy theory. You should look into it because, again, Grey Wolf could be dismissed as a conspiracy theory, and then you look into it, and next thing you know, you realize there's all these testimonies, there's all these facts. But sure. I think that I think that we should look at the things that we know for a fact, and the things that the things that are clear. Like you said, money corrupting everything from foreign policy to corporations. Funding both sides of conflicts and all these things. And I think that we should look at those things and focus our energy on that instead of trying to find links from, some reptilian bloodline and stuff like that. So I think that sometimes what it does, it gets the focus off things that we know for sure are messed up.
At first, Ricky, I thought going through Grey Wolf and looking at all the newspaper reports, the contemporaneous reports, the FBI reports at the time, I was thinking, there's serious disinformation going on here. There's all talk of Antarctic bases, and there's talk of Nazi moon bases, and every time that a reputable publication or reputable news agency runs a story on Adolf Hitler potentially being in South America or Martin Bormann being in South America, there's usually some sort of UFO story floating around at the same time to panic people, or a Soviets are going to bomb America type of story. And there does seem to be. It's not like an organized campaign of disinformation, but it does seem that they put enough out there, or somebody puts enough out there to try and distract everybody from focusing in on what is really going on. And it's very difficult to focus on what's really going on because even now, I mean, with the advent of the internet, we are thrown so much information. I don't know whether marijuana cures cancer, but I get 5 or 6 postings on my wall a day about it. But it's something I haven't looked into. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But then you'll get so many other things out there, so much more information. When Snowden went to Russia, suddenly there was all this information coming out about UFO sightings and alien presence on the planet, and all back to Snowden. Well, to my knowledge, he's never held a press conference which said any of that, because all his press conferences have been covered by Reuters, the Associated Press, serious, proper, still news organizations, I hope. And yet all this stuff was dedicated to him. It all came out. And what it did was make a lot of Snowden's material, the real material, look just as stupid as the far-out conspiracy theory stuff that was supposedly coming from him at the same time. We're conned. We're conned a lot of the time.
Well, yeah, I think they end up bundling all that stuff together, where so you end up relating Snowden with FBI, UFOs and all that stuff, and I think that like you said, I think it ends up, people end up dismissing it, and I think that if we just look at the facts and we look at, the true, I mean, okay, like you said, there's tons of I end up, same thing with my wall on Twitter and on Facebook. You end up getting all types of stories, and most of them we don't have time to research. But the thing is that, unfortunately, sometimes people don't know how to filter out what's true and what's not, and
it's immensely difficult. It's immensely difficult. It seems to be becoming more difficult, really, to find out the truth about anything, because there are so many sources of quotes news, and I think that makes us all feel quite nervous about things, because we now don't know who to trust. Here am I now at 55. I used to believe pretty much what our governments told us. I believed stuff that came in from proper journalists, many of whom I know from working in the field. I don't believe what my government tells me anymore. And I definitely don't believe what your government tells me anymore.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
It's just, and that sort of puts you in a very difficult position. I don't believe what the Vatican tells me. I don't believe what the Catholic Church tells me, and yet I was brought up a good Catholic. Now you have paedophile priests across the planet and dubious deals done by them with the Nazis. You wonder how this can have anything at all to do with God or being a decent Christian. You just wonder. But anyway, that's very off topic. So.
Yeah, but I think they're all important topics, and they all have something to do with your book, because I think that it's one of those things where I do think that people, when first glimpse of the title, you might think, okay, conspiracy theory, or you might just feel, it might just get bundled in with all the, that news feed of does cannabis cure cancer or not, and all these things, and I think that I think that the beautiful thing about obviously living in our time is the fact that we do have all this access to information. But like you said, I think it can be a pro and con to it, where the cons are the fact that you get so much information that you just don't have the time to filter it, and almost every theory out there you could find a contradicting argument on both sides. So it's just like, it's hard to I think the hardest part is taking in all the information and then having the intelligence to be able to to figure out which one makes the most sense, or which one has the most evidence to back it and stuff like that. So that can be a very hard thing to do.
It's and dealing with a subject like Adolf Hitler, I mean, one of the most hated, disgusting people of the 20th century, you do find it very difficult to find out what's true. All I can say is that all our witnesses, none of them were paid a penny. None of them were paid to say any of this. The ones I've met and interviewed personally have been sane, sensible, and I've asked all of them, why now in their 80s they wanted to do it. They'd say, because we don't want to take this to the grave. We believe people should know the truth of what happened, and we've been too scared to talk about it before. I mean, we had 2 witnesses in Argentina who received death threats from persons or people unknown while they were talking to us. One of them refused to speak to us ever again. She's so scared. And it was at that stage that I started to take it really seriously, because if people are going to threaten people with death, they're trying to hide something, and they have been trying to hide something.
How long do you think he lived there, and how old was he when you assume he might have passed away? And
well, I mean, our information is that he lived there for 17 years after his arrival in 1945, that he died on February the 3rd, 1962, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, attended by his personal physician, Dr. Otto Lehmann. He had become increasingly ill as he got older. He had cardiac problems. Doesn't look like he had Parkinson's disease, according to the notes from his doctor, but it does look like he'd had scarlet fever after World War I. And later in life, scarlet fever can affect your movement and can give you a slight palsy effect, so you have shaking. He didn't live a very happy life, it seems. Ava Brown left him in the 1950s with their 2 daughters and went off to live in Nicosia, in the foothills of the Andes, away from him, and seems to have gone on to live quite an active and very long life, dying sometime in the early 2000s. Both daughters are still alive, as far as I'm aware. But I don't see it as my job to go chasing children of evil people.
Yeah, and so and it seemed like from your film and clips I've seen and stuff like that, it seems like he was really depressed. I could just imagine going from the most powerful man, one of the most powerful men on earth, to all of a sudden being this old and lonely and sick man.
Lost, lonely soul, betrayed by his beloved party members, left by his wife. I mean, personally, I prefer this idea of a long, sad, depressed death for this pig than the idea that he shot himself in the head in some sort of brave act of Gotterdammerung, Wagnerian, I will place myself on the stage of history as somebody who died for what I believed in. Well, he didn't. He snuck off with loads of money and lived a very comfortable, aging life in Argentina. And again, when Bormann arrived in Argentina in 1948, you had to go through Bormann to get to Hitler. For the earlier period, it was pretty much the SS men who'd escaped with him and his contacts in Argentina that looked after him. But he was kept pretty much in seclusion from the time Bormann arrived.
Do you think that he did have intentions of possibly rising again, or do you think that there's any links to maybe some, I guess, secret Nazi party or a group of Nazis that are still together and possibly, because I mean, obviously after World War I, it didn't take long for them to rise up again and become a military power
Sure.
in secret.
No, I think that after 1945, and there's lots of information, lots of evidence of people trying to rebuild the Nazi party. One of them, a man called Hans Ulrich Rudel, who was the most decorated pilot of World War II on any side, and was a man Hitler always said, I would have loved it if he'd been my son. Rudel went back to Germany and tried to start up the Nazi party again. There were various other attempts to start a Nazi party again. I mean, it wouldn't have been difficult when the German government were paying former members of the SS and the Waffen-SS pensions that were 30% higher than other people who'd paid in the German military. So if you'd been a Wehrmacht soldier in World War II, your pension was 100%. And if you'd been SS, and this is in a democratic Germany post-war, your pension was 130%. There was no denazification of any real type in Germany. The Nazis simply took off their Hugo Boss designed uniforms and put on their Hugo Boss designed civilian suits. But luckily, the sort of military anti-Semitism seemed to have faded with that swastika. And they went on to be reasonable democratic allies for us to have in Europe. And very important to remember that Germany was necessary. It was where we had hundreds of thousands of troops stationed post-World War II to worry about the threat from the Soviets. I think a great deal of that Soviet threat was actually puffed up by the German intelligence organization, all of whom had been Nazi officers, so that America and Britain worried more about the Soviet Union than the growth and rebirth of Germany. Not Nazi Germany, but the rebirth of Germany, the economic miracle. Nothing miraculous, they just brought the money back in from the countries they'd sent it out to.
Yeah, and your story it's so intriguing, and just hearing stories about World War II or before World War II about how they were secret about how they were rebuilding their military again and all this stuff. And then hearing your book and just all the interviews and all this evidence, it makes you wonder, like, what could something like that possibly happen again? And you ever ponder on that?
I've been asked to. I must admit it's not something that I'm very good at, because again, like you, I like to research stuff incredibly thoroughly. What I do know is that Germany is the economic powerhouse in the European Union. What I do know is that Hitler's plans for a huge European state are coming to pass in one way or another. And I do know that Germany can nowadays, instead of sending panzers in, can simply say to governments like Greece, well, you are going to do it this way, or we're going to pull the plug on you. So they no longer have to send the Luftwaffe in or the panzer regiments in. They have the economic muscle and the economic power to get people to do what they want to do. But I see no sign of the current German state being Nazi in any form, or anti-Semitic, or ugly in that way. So, no, I mean, still, even though we've had quite a lot of right-wing success, and I mean nasty fascist success in European elections recently, I still think Europe is 60 odd years after World War II, pretty democratic, pretty liberal. That doesn't mean that the companies like Mannesmann and the huge German infrastructure companies, Siemens, aren't making a load of money out of things everywhere.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I would agree with you. And I mean, I guess there's always the fear of history repeating, and usually, it does, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it be coming out of Germany or something like that. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. It's amazing. I remember growing up and just reading about World War II and learning about it in school, and of course they only taught us the boring stuff. They didn't teach us all the good stuff which I think is one of the reasons why so many people, as they get older, get more intrigued with history, because they realize that history repeats, and if you don't learn history, it will repeat. And there's so many other really interesting stories in history that we just, we're still taught that Christopher Columbus found America and blah blah blah, and
I think there's quite a few Vikings and various other people who would have disagreed with the fact
exactly.
that found America. And again, why isn't that more publicized? I mean, that's real archaeology that proves that there were Europeans there and other races there well before Columbus and American Vespucci. I mean, it's just not true, and yet it's still accepted. But some people believe in creationism, so you can worry about that.
Yeah. I think Graham Hancock was one of the first authors to really open my eyes about possibly alternative history and suppressed history and
Yes.
and his conflicts that he had with the historians, like you said, like once they got this diploma or they got this plaque saying that they're experts in this information. Now if that information changes, that plaque almost is meaningless, and I think that's maybe one of the things they worry about.
Yeah, I mean, we've been described as being 4,000% wrong by one man who claims he's a historian in Britain. Well, why can't I just be 100% wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he didn't do maths, I don't know. But 4,000% wrong? I mean, it's just farcical. But to even come up with a comment like that, instead of saying, no, there is forensic evidence that Adolf Hitler died in the bunker, we know from Hugh Trevor Roper that this happened. Well, actually go back and look at my evidence and Simon's evidence. I mean, if people would do that, there's enough pages of reference material in the back of Grey Wolf for people to do their own research. And originally, when Sterling, our great publishers in America, took the book on, we finally agreed that they could put on the front of the book, Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler, the case presented. And I think that's on all the hardback copies, because that's what we're doing, is we're presenting a case. It's not some sort of messianic crusade that I'm doing. I mean, I hate Nazis, I hate fascists, it's disgusting creatures. So I'm not trying to change history to make this guy look good or anything, but I do think it's important that people should know what really happened, or as close as we can get to what really happened. And what we're told about the death of Adolf Hitler is simply a lie. I mean, I can't say it any simpler than that. We may not have got it all right in Grey Wolf. New evidence comes up all the time, some of it contradictory to what we've got, but normally I like to have at least two sources on contradictory evidence. And some of it even more interesting. I mean, I was sent a photograph of Hitler in the 1950s in a place in Argentina, and it looks like it could be Hitler. At the moment, I haven't got the money to go and have that checked like I did last time, but I will have it checked, and we will continue to look for it and to look for the trail. But it's the money thing that's really important. It's not about one man escaping or 100,000 Nazis escaping. It's what happened to the money. Money doesn't disappear.
Yeah.
It stays there. It's useful. People use it all the time. And, with Hitler having a personal fortune of £3.6 billion, $8 billion, which has never been found, well, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is. And like you said, it doesn't disappear, and somebody is using it, has it, or whatever. And I think it's the whole thing's just it's so intriguing. I think it's amazing when you run into a book like this and researchers like this who completely just change your perspective on history and remind us that we don't just take the official story, don't just take Oliver Stone came out with this great documentary films. Well, it's a series of films called The Untold History of United States, and
Yes.
I highly recommend it to anybody who hasn't watched it. And it's amazing, and that's, and Howard Zinn obviously wrote the People's History of the United States, and there's all these great books and there's this great work that really will change your perspective, and realize that, even though we China and North Korea, they control their media and they sell propaganda. The U.S. also does very similar things, obviously to that extent, but our mainstream media is basically controlled by big corporations, and like you said, it can, in simple way of understanding it, it's all about money. It's about ones and zeros. It's about how to marketing. Obviously, commercials will pay to be on CNN, so they have some influence on what's broadcasted on CNN.
Yeah.
So I think that when you run,
don't get me wrong. I've got no problems in making a buck.
Yeah,
I've got no problems with capitalism, but it's how it's done is the thing, and it's not like a mom and pop store who sell good stuff and have good client base and they make a reasonable living out of it. These are people who will screw over whole populations so that they make huge profits out of it. And it's just wrong, really. I mean, well, for me, it's morally wrong. So, deals done between mass murdering Nazis and clean living Americans and British as well. Let's not just blame the Americans. I mean, throughout World War II, the head of the Reichsbank and the head of the Bank of England met regularly in Geneva at the International Bank of Settlements. And they didn't just meet for business reasons, because they'd been doing this since the 1930s. They were homosexual lovers, and we have proof of that, letters of their gay relationship. I have no problems with gay relationships. I have gay friends. But it's just that these two men, the most important men in the economies of the Empire of Great Britain and the Nazi Empire, were not only doing business regularly in Basel, they were also lovers. Why isn't that in the history books?
Yeah, that's
because that'd make you think, wouldn't it? Just a bit.
Yeah, definitely, and that's crazy. Well, thanks, Gerrard. Thank you so much for being with me. I really appreciate your time. I know
Thanks, Ricky.
You're in beautiful France, so I'm sure it's a Saturday on beautiful France. You probably have plenty of other things you'd rather be doing. So, but hey, thank you so much for being with me. Where can tell us where we can find your book? I'm obviously your book is on Amazon, and I'm guessing all the regular places you can find books, and your film, I believe, is coming out.
And it's also should be.
Oh, I think I lost you for a second. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
The book is available on Amazon. It's also available from Barnes and Noble and pretty much good booksellers anywhere. The hardback's still out there, and the paperback as well. The DVD should be on American shelves in a couple of months. We've just delivered to America. And it'll also be available for streaming and downloading from iTunes and various other places. So it will be out there.
Yeah, awesome. And I'll put links to all that stuff underneath our show description on our YouTube channel and all that stuff. So definitely check that out. And thank you so much, Gerrard. I'm really looking forward to watching the final version of the movie and sharing it with some friends. Because I'll tell you, out of all my guests, I was so excited when you agreed to be on and just telling people about it. People were just so intrigued with the story and so intrigued. And I believe a couple of my friends already ordered your book. And before they even looked into it, I just told them about the book and really what the case that it was putting out, and they were just so intrigued with it, they ordered it immediately. And like I said, I think that the big thing is your background. I mean, you're not, no offense towards Alex Jones, he puts out some good information sometimes, but you're not Alex Jones, and you're a real journalist, which there's not many anymore, and you have a history of investigating things, and you really don't have a dog in the fight to sell a silly story, so yeah, so I just think it's and like you said, people talk about evidence that you have. Well, there's really no evidence that he died in the bunker either. So just like, I don't know why they're putting you on or having higher standards for your evidence compared to the official story. That seems like a silly debate too.
Completely. I mean, there are so many eyewitnesses to his presence in Argentina post-war, and Hoover of the FBI definitely didn't believe he was dead. He had agents looking for him. And there are dozens of reports which are available in the FBI files, some of which aren't, which are dubious, but quite a few others are very, very serious reports. So the information is available and out there, but not everybody has the 5 years that Simon and I took to put it together. So, and are continuing to do so. But thank you very much for having me, Ricky. It's been fun.
Hey, thanks, Gerrard. Have a good one.
Take care, Andrew.
Take care. Thank you.
And the ripple effect.